So, good morning and welcome. Thank you for coming this morning. So, we're continuing with a commentary to Atisha's jeweled garland. But before beginning, please try to set a motivation for listening to the teachings. These teachings are not just information that is to be gathered, but rather it's something that is for transforming one's mind. So in a sense, the Dharma teachings are said to be like medicine. And so all of the internal problems that one has, particularly problems of attachment, anger, closed-mindedness, jealousy, self-importance, like that, all of these negative states of mind are the illness, and the Buddha Dharma, the teachings of the Buddha, are the medicine for it. So in order for the teachings to function medicinally, they need to be listened to with the right motivation. So because these teachings are part of the universal vehicle, Mahayana, they are meant specifically for persons who are either on the universal vehicle path or aspire for it. To be actually on the universal vehicle path, the Mahayana, one has to have a effortless bodhicitta, or spirit of enlightenment, which is an aspiration to achieve supreme Buddhahood in order to benefit all living beings. So this is the kind of motivation that we should try to cultivate, even if it's just the words. But it's better to have some appreciation for that motivation. It's based upon altruism, which is the attitude that is more concerned about the welfare of others than oneself. And altruism arises from compassion, and in this case, great compassion. So compassion is not unusual for a healthy human being. When we see others who are suffering, we would hope and wish that they could be free from that suffering. That's compassion. Great compassion extends to all living beings, not just to a select few. It is all living beings, regardless of whatever category of life they fall into, regardless of whether it's gross suffering or very subtle suffering. And it also includes taking personal responsibility to find a solution and lead them out of their suffering and into happiness. So the only way to accomplish that is by oneself becoming a fully enlightened being. The reason is that in order to know what living beings need to do in order to change the way they are acting, which is causing them to suffer, into only acting in ways that bring happiness, one has to have a deep and extensive knowledge. And for that knowledge to be continuous, so that if a person doesn't take advantage of an opportunity to change themselves that would be inspired by enlightening activity of the Buddhas, then in the next moment, what would they need to do? And a Buddha would know, moment to moment to moment, what a person needs to do in order to find an escape from suffering and the achievement of happiness. So that's something that's possible. These obstacles to knowledge that prevent us from being able to function in that way are not inherent in our mind. Our mind is basically what it does is it knows objects. It can know everything and anything. That's what it's capable of. And just as we have the experience of overcoming ignorance by, you know, learning various subjects, our mind is capable of increasing its knowledge. And with the right point of view, then one can actually uproot these obstacles to knowledge and enable one to achieve Buddhahood, just as Shakyamuni did, and all the other countless Buddhas before him and the ones who come after him. And we can do the same. But in order to achieve that, it requires an aspiration. You need to have a wish to achieve it. And by relying on great compassion, one has the motivation. One must do everything that one can to try to lead living beings from suffering into happiness. So the one thing one can do that will accomplish that purpose is to achieve Buddhahood. And so it's important to try to aspire to achieve Buddhahood. And listening to these teachings with that motivation. And this, the title of this text that we're going through is the Bodhisattva's Jeweled Garland. So a Bodhisattva is somebody who has developed the effortless bodhicitta, which is this aspiration for enlightenment for the benefit of all living beings that has become so familiar to them in their mind that it arises effortlessly. Whereas in the beginning, we have to think about the different causes and conditions, cultivating loving kindness for living beings so that our mind is more sympathetic to whatever their condition is, which will then help compassion to arise. And then as compassion gets stronger, we develop this unique attitude of taking personal responsibility to lead each and every being from suffering into happiness. And then when we try to figure out how to do that, we learn about the possibility of achieving Buddhahood, and then we aspire to achieve Buddhahood. So Bodhisattva is someone who's so familiar with that process of cultivating bodhicitta that it arises effortlessly and spontaneously in their mind. So this is the audience that Atisha was directing his teaching towards. And so listening to these teachings with that motivation, with that purpose in mind, is ideal. One of the teachers that I've had, I think it was Som Rinpoche, he mentioned one time that, the ordinary person is only motivated to achieve the happiness of this life. So that's the worldly person. They don't think about future lifetimes. They're just concerned about the happiness of the present life. And so they use all of their effort and their time and resources to accomplish that purpose. And maybe they're successful and maybe they're not. From the Buddhist point of view, it depends upon their karma. Just like somebody who works real hard to obtain wealth and doesn't succeed, even though they've put in all the effort that would be required, but they just didn't get the right breaks, so to speak. So that's the breaks are called karma. That's in karma, it's sometimes it's because it's an unusual term, it's a Sanskrit term. It actually means something simple. It means actions of body, speech, and mind, particularly actions of the mind, our intention or will to do something, and then the actions of body and speech that follow from that, like that. And that will or intention, which is the, the real substance of karma, that arises by depending upon our way of thinking. We motivate ourselves to engage in some action, and then we decide to do it. And when we think I'm going to do it, that's intention. And that leaves an imprint in the mind, as well as motivating the actions of body and speech to accomplish whatever the purpose is. And that imprint is the cause of future experiences. An experience is a mental factor that when one comes into contact with a pleasant object, one feels pleasure. When one comes into contact with an unpleasant object, one feels some kind of suffering, or a neutral object, and one has an experience neither painful nor pleasurable. So yeah, depending upon one's karma, one might be successful in accomplishing the goals of the current lifetime. But at the end of the life, there was no preparation for the next life. So then it's all of the actions of one's present life and previous lifetimes become the force for generating, the thought at the time of death that becomes the seed for the future lifetime. The initial level spiritual motivation is somebody who is seeking mainly the happiness of the next life. So they engage in practices to avoid non-virtuous action and to practice virtuous action. And as a result of that, they have a ticket. At the time of death, they have a ticket to take them to a good rebirth or a ticket to a bad rebirth, depending upon how successful they were in avoiding non-virtuous actions and practicing virtuous actions. But a person who's really motivated to achieve a higher rebirth, through their lifetime, they practice avoiding non-virtuous actions. Whenever a non-virtuous action arises, even though they try not to, they immediately apply purification remedies to it to weaken or eliminate that negative karmic seed. And so at the time of death, they die without fear. They know that they've created the causes for a good rebirth. Then the person of intermediate spiritual scope is one who is seeking freedom from the death and rebirth through the force of karma. Because even if you achieve a higher rebirth, eventually the energy that caused one to achieve that rebirth will be used up. Then one dies, and once again, one is forced through the force of karma to take another rebirth. And who knows where it's going to go. So not being satisfied with that condition of uncontrolled death and rebirth, there's the aspiration to achieve liberation. And through the cultivation of the three higher trainings, the higher training in morality, the higher training in concentration, and the higher training in wisdom, one can achieve freedom from uncontrolled death and rebirth. Freedom from the suffering created by the afflictions and the actions motivated by the afflictions. And then the person of highest scope of spiritual motivation is the person who cultivates the bodhicitta, this spirit of enlightenment. And not only does one achieve liberation, not with the bodhicitta, you accomplish getting good rebirths. You accomplish a freedom from being reborn through karma and afflictions, and you achieve the cause to achieve the supreme happiness of supreme Buddhahood. And even in the present lifetime, The bodhicitta accumulates a lot of merit. So as a consequence of that, one ends up having a better experience. And also because the bodhicitta causes oneself to become a force of goodness for all living beings, then one feels a great satisfaction that one has achieved the highest purpose of one's life by using it to achieve Buddhahood for the sake of all living beings. So try as much as possible to generate that thought. Okay, so we finished verse 10, and now we're starting verse 11. This is very handy, Bay. Thank you so much. I see more and more people using these rather than paper copy. I walked out the door this morning without my paper copy because I had to bring the garbage out and take the garbage out on the street because it gets collected tomorrow morning. I left everything inside the house because it was raining, and then I forgot it. So even if you try to generate good motivations, it doesn't necessarily mean you're going to remember everything you need to remember. And you still have to take out the garbage because who else is going to do it, right? So this next verse is abandon attachment to all things and abide free of desire. So this is Lama Atisha. And Atisha was this great pandit of ancient India he was born in 980, passed away in like 1052, something like that. He was, at that time, he was the most exalted master of Buddhism to go to Tibet. And so, and when he arrived in Tibet, of course, Buddhism had been existing in Tibet since the 8th century. And but over time, especially after a very recent and the last of the emperors of the empire of Tibet, he closed down many of the monasteries. A number of the aristocrats there complained because the monasteries were being supported by land that they were given by previous emperors, and a lot of aristocrats didn't like the fact that their land had been given away by some emperor, so they complained. And so he decided to close down a lot of the monasteries. So as a consequence, those monasteries were main centers of learning. So it wasn't as easy to gain a good education in Buddhism. And so a number of misconceptions arose. And so Lama Atisha felt that his main responsibility was to ensure that the people really knew what the practice of Buddhism was. So we find him again and again in this text saying, give up attachment, give up pride, negative pride, right? All of these over and over and over again, he's saying this because that's basic Buddhism. And that if one, and especially a lot of the ones that he would be teaching were practitioners. And so a practitioner can develop pride in their knowledge, right? And then feel important. Or maybe they're practicing developing the bodhicitta motivation, and then they feel somehow superior. It's possible. Our minds are capable of just incredible ideas that come to the mind, and so he was dedicating his life, and he did. he when he went to Tibet, the abbot of Vikramashila Monastery gave him permission to go, but he was thinking maybe for a couple of years. But then Atisha got permission to stay longer, and he just decided to stay there for the rest of his life. So he taught in Tibet for 20 years, and that was all across Tibet he taught. He had great disciples from the east of Tibet to the west of Tibet. So abandon attachment to all things. And attachment, attachment arises from a unbalanced way of paying attention to objects. So attention or mental engagement is a mental factor that causes us to apprehend an object by means of certain characteristics of the object. Now our mind has every moment of mind that we have, because it is a mind, then it has to function with the basic definition of mind, which is to know, to be aware. And what does knowing and being aware mean? It means to apprehend objects. So the mental factor of attention or mental engagement is apprehending objects by means of specific characteristics of the object. And any object can have multiple characteristics. And it also depends upon the person. They can they can view an object in a certain way. That, like, take black sesame seeds. In Asian cooking, black sesame seeds are well known. But for many, like I grew up in the household of an Irish mother, I never saw a black sesame seed. And the first time that I saw it was in a Tibetan Buddhist context, where they would use black sesame seed in fire pujas, where you're going to purify negative karma, and the black sesame seed symbolizes all those negative karmic seeds. So I didn't even see it as food, right? So whenever black sesame seed would arise, I think, oh, that's really important for fire pujas. Didn't even think of it as food. So it's like that, objects have all kinds of characteristics, but not necessarily abiding in the object itself. So when we engage in an object, it depends on many circumstances how we apprehend, what characteristics we apprehend the object by. And the unbalanced mental engagement or attention, which gives rise to attachment, engages the object by means of only the positive aspects of that object, and it ignores any of the negative side of the object, right? So if you buy a new car, you're seeing all the positive sides of that car, and you may not see the impact that that purchase will have on your bank account and your ability to pay upcoming taxes. Like that. It's an unbalanced engagement. You don't see the entirety of the situation. And as a result, you hold that object and you don't want to let go of it, because that object you also see as being the resource for your happiness, right? And so you don't want to let go of it. So that's attachment. And if somehow you get separated from the object, then you want to immediately get it back. That's, again, attachment. So attachment is considered a mental affliction because it arises from a misapprehension of the reality of the object, and let alone the ultimate reality, but even the customary or conventional reality, the relative reality of the object. It doesn't have the full understanding of it, and it causes problems. Yeah. not wanting to let go of that object can motivate one to do all kinds of things, right? And if somebody tries to interfere with your hold of that object, then anger arises like that. And anger has, it's like limitless how strong anger can become. Almost, not quite, but it can cause terrible things. So it's abandon attachment to all things and abide free from desire. So desire here is another word for attachment, although desire is a little bit different. And what he's talking about here is negative desire. We can talk about negative desire and positive desire. In Buddhist terminology, positive desire is called aspiration. No, you're aspiring for something good, right? Like aspiring to become a Buddha, or aspiring to become a better human being, or aspiring to be able to make offerings to teachers or to monasteries, like that. That's positive desire or aspiration. But negative desire is desiring things that are only going to cause problems for oneself, but one doesn't see that out of this wrong or unbalanced engagement with the object. So if you're free from such desire and attachment, then there's a great freedom that arises in one's mind. It's like when you wake up in the morning and you can't sleep anymore, what are you going to do? Well, if you don't have any attachment or this negative desire, then the only thing that's left is one's aspiration for what is good and wholesome. So one uses one's life to do that. So one might, if what one wants to do is meditate, one can meditate. If there's prayers that one wants to do, if there's um, doing a being of benefit to other living beings, one engages in that. There's all kinds of positive things that one will do with one's life that and are free from this, the kind of pull and how attachment to desire just fills your mind with the object, and then there's no space for the positive things that we need to do with our life. So you abide in a freedom when you're free from desire and attachment. Attachment fails to bring even the higher realms. In fact, it kills the life of true liberation. Yeah, so any living being can act out of attachment. You don't have to be a human being to have attachment, right? Even the animals who they have attachment to each other, you know, they have attachment to the area where they hunt and the like. And if anybody else encroaches in that, boom, they're on them to try to get rid of them. So you don't need to be a human being to continue to act out of attachment. So there's no reason then to be reborn as a human being. And because of attachment, one engages in all kinds of non-virtuous activities, like the activities that are the opposite of the 10 virtuous activities, engaging in killing, stealing, sexual misconduct, lying, divisiveness, harsh speech, useless speech, you know, contemplating taking what belongs to others, malicious thoughts, wrong views, and all of that will create seeds for taking lower rebirth. It kills the life of true liberation, because true liberation is about trying to achieve freedom from attachment. Like if you've ever been frightened of death, your own future death, if that thought has ever scared you, then no matter how peaceful you were the moment before that thought arose, then suddenly you feel great insecurity. And there is a grasping for, your existence. And the way you perceive yourself is depending upon this body. And you know that at death time, you won't have this body. So what will your identity be? At the time of death, it's very common for an ordinary person to grasp at the thought of oneself because you fear it will disappear. And the way you appear to yourself at that time will depend upon the way that you have identified being during your lifetime in the strongest identity or the most habitual way of identifying yourself. Like that. That will arise, and that image will have been created by actions that you did, and that will ignite the seed of those former actions that still remain in the consciousness. And so one goes into the next lifetime being controlled by the attachment to a personal identity, which then causes one to take rebirth in order to experience that kind of identity. So liberation is liberation from that uncontrolled death and rebirth through the force of affliction and karma. So if one doesn't try to abandon attachment and negative desire, then one doesn't have any real life of a path to liberation. And also, sometimes the life of liberation is referring to the practice of moral discipline because it's the basis or foundation for developing the other higher trainings, like higher training in concentration, higher training in wisdom. And it's very difficult to keep even a simple vow of not stealing or not killing other living beings if one doesn't work at overcoming attachment. Yeah, like because of the rain recently, the ants have come in the house. And so, if you are trying, to just follow, avoiding the 10 non-virtuous actions, you don't want to kill the ants. So when you see them, it's like, oh, be careful where I put my hands, where I put, just have to be careful like that. But a person with attachment, it's like, ants invading my house, uninvited. Uninvited guests, they're no guests of mine, and then they do whatever they can to kill them, bring out the insect spray to kill them and things like that. So, it's hard to maintain the life of the path to liberation if one is under the control of attachment. So that's why Atisha says we have to abandon attachment to all things and abide free of desire. All things. I heard the story of this one a monk in Tibet a long time ago, and he practiced the Kalachakra Tantra. And you might have heard of the Kalachakra because the Dalai Lama has given the Kalachakra initiation many times. So, but he actually practiced it. It was his main practice. So he was trying to take rebirth in the pure land of Kalachakra. And at the end of his life, and he was a simple meditator. He just meditated in a simple cabin, or could have been a cave. Caves are like cabins, though, because, they put a nice wall with a window and a door and try to make it comfortable, but without too much stuff. You can't become very attached to a cave, so to speak. But definitely it shouldn't be dripping with water. It should be someplace you can keep fairly warm, like that. So that's where he was meditating. But then he had, and he knew this one practice of transferring his consciousness to this pure land of Kalachakra. and he was not able to do it. And his main teacher, who knew that this monk was at the end of his life, saw why he wasn't able to do it. And the reason why he wasn't able to transfer his consciousness was because he was so attached to his butter tea. You know, most people in this country would have no problem being detached to butter tea. But in Tibet, it's made very well, and it's almost a meal in itself, and it helps keep you warm because the butter, it digests and helps keep you warm. So he was attached to his butter tea. And so his master sent a message telepathically to him saying, it was Tushita Pure Land is where he wanted to go. And he said, there's better butter tea in Tushita. And his mind immediately left for there. So, so that's what Atisha is saying. Abandon attachment to all things. We can become attached to such simple things, hardly noticing it. Okay, in the next verse, when you encounter the causes of happiness, in these always persevere. So perseverance or enthusiastic perseverance, this is a state of mind that's defined as delighting in virtuous conduct. So any kind of virtuous conduct, then you delight in it, and so you want to engage in it and especially accomplish the goals of that virtuous conduct. And as you develop your enthusiastic perseverance, then you'll stay with that effort until that goal is accomplished. And that's what Atisha is trying to encourage, to cultivate our enthusiastic perseverance so that we don't, give up, so that we don't become discouraged, so that we don't lose our time through laziness, like that. So he said, always persevere in the causes of happiness. Don't persevere in the causes of suffering. Persevere in the causes of happiness. And whichever task you take up first, address this task primarily. In this way, you ensure the success of both tasks, both the task you took up first and the task that comes to mind later. And you think, oh, that's a great idea. I'm going to do that. But he's saying, don't do that. Because if you form the habit of giving up the work for a good, positive result because of something else that comes up later, then you'll always have this tendency to give up the action for something new that comes up. And there'll always be something new coming up. All these positive things come with advertising. And it's very persuasive. And so you give up something that's good and wholesome that you're doing for something else, then you'll give up that, you'll give up that. So he said, don't do that, he said. Stick with the first one, and you'll develop this training, this discipline in your mind that will enable you to succeed in the next one that comes up. So stay with it rather than changing around all the time. And this is particularly significant for, people with, like the Buddha, he taught for over 40 years to all levels of society, and, you know, so that meant the highest level bodhisattvas, which an ordinary human being couldn't even see, he would be teaching. And then, of course, even within the human realm, he would be teaching kings to beggars, be teaching materialistic people to spiritually minded people, people with great psychic powers like Madhyalyana, one of his great disciples, had famous for his psychic powers, teaching him to somebody else who had no powers at all. So he taught many, many, many different methods to overcome negative mind, develop the positive states of mind, to achieve higher rebirth, to achieve liberation from uncontrolled death and rebirth, and to achieve Buddhahood. And because everybody's different, he had to teach many different methods. There's not just one method that is suitable for everyone, right? That's Geshe-la and Dargye once advised, don't think that you have to practice in the same way that somebody else practiced. Like when people read 100,000 songs of Milarepa or Milarepa's biography, they might aspire to be the kind of yogi that Milarepa was. Not easy. Not easy to do that. And nobody expects you to do that because everybody's different and everybody has different needs and different abilities and different aspirations. So that consequently, there's different methods. And that's why we should, respect these different methods, but you don't have to necessarily have to practice all of them. You practice the ones that's suitable for you. The next verse, since you take no pleasure in negative deeds, when a thought of self-importance arises, at that instant deflate your pride and recall your teacher's instructions. So in this translation, it says, since you take no pleasure in negative actions. In another translation that I read, it says, do not take pleasure in negative actions. So this translation is more optimistic. So, from Atisha's point of view, he was asked one time by his great disciple, John Domba, um, and Atisha said, negative action is anything done just for the happiness of the current life, because it puts a seed in your mind to take a lower rebirth. It is not something that requires a higher rebirth. And that seed will stay in one's mind until it's either purified or it ripens. If there are the right cooperative conditions, then it'll ripen and can throw one into another rebirth. No matter how small that action appeared, if that happens to ripen at the time of death because of the right cooperative conditions, that's what will throw you into the next lifetime. And Atisha is saying that actions that are done only for the sake of the current lifetime leave such potencies to take a lower rebirth. So take no pleasure in negative actions. And when the thought of self-importance, this is again, several times already in verses, he's referred to self-importance as something as a negative thing. And and he was teaching, he was invited to Tibet by a local king in the western part of Tibet. So, they can feel kind of pompous. So maybe the teaching was for that king. Maybe the teaching was for other aristocrats who might have found themselves higher than others. It may have been toward scholars who may have the tendency of generating the self-importance, feeling themselves as superior to others and therefore should be honored in special ways. So he's saying, no, when self-importance arises, at that instant, deflate your pride and recall your teacher's instructions. And one of the instructions, well, there's several ways of deflating negative pride. And one is bringing to mind everything you don't know. There's lots of things we don't know. So being aware of your ignorance will deflate that pride. Then also being aware of all the times that you don't follow through with the kind of practices that you have dedicated yourself to do. Like, making offerings to the 3 jewels of refuge 3 times a day. As a Buddhist, that's what we do to support our refuge. But we don't always do that because sometimes we decide, well, I eat 3 times a day, so I'll offer the first bite of food and drink to the 3 jewels of refuge. But then there we are, food in mouth, chewing it. And then we think, oh, I was supposed to. So remembering things like that also deflates pride. And then also remembering death. So no matter how proud you are, you're not going to live forever. Death is going to come. And at that point, it's going to be entirely up to the strength of your Dharma practice where you're going to go. So, and we all know how strong our Dharma practice is. Even if we get up in the early hours of the morning and we could start doing our practices, it's awful easy to lay back down and go back to sleep again. So we all know where our Dharma practice stands. So that helps to deflate any sense of self-importance. When discouraging thoughts arise, uplift your mind and, okay. So discouraging thoughts, that's included within this mind of laziness. And a discouraging thought is thinking that one is incapable of doing some Dharma practice. So like, for instance, we can generate the thought to achieve enlightenment for the welfare of all living beings, but the thought may arise, oh, that's too high for me. I could never do that. And then that thought prevents you from cultivating the spirit of enlightenment. Just that thought, that discouraging thought. And at that time, one needs to apply an antidote, thinking that there's no reason why I can't achieve enlightenment because all the Buddhas of the past, present, and future were once just like me. And yet they generated the wish to achieve enlightenment for the sake of all living beings. I can too. I have the seeds of loving kindness. I have the seeds of compassion. All I have to do is grow those, exercise those more, and then that will give rise to this thought of enlightenment, and I can become a bodhisattva and accomplish everything that they did. Or when we think that, oh, that is, I wish I had better concentration, but it's just not going to happen in this lifetime. That thought prevents you from exercising your concentration. There might not be enough time in this lifetime to develop perfect concentration, but you can improve it. You can, and the work and the effort of trying to improve it becomes a cause for taking a rebirth where you can continue to cultivate good concentration for the spiritual path. So we need to uplift our mind. The Buddha said that even insects can become a Buddha if they have powerful enough perseverance and enthusiasm. So they can't even think, whereas we can develop enthusiasm, the delight in virtue by contemplating the benefits of virtuous activities. So meditate on the emptiness of both. So both here is referring to there are good things that happen in our life and make us feel happy. There are bad things that happen and make us feel unhappy. But these things that are occurring in our life, they pass. They don't remain. They come and they go. They have our mind doesn't stay in those states because they arose by depending upon causes which they themselves are impermanent. They come and they go. Therefore, the effects that they produce come and go. And when you analyze these things, you find that none of them, because they are impermanent, none of them can exist in their own right to sustain themselves because they arise by depending upon other things, causes and conditions. So they don't arise through their own inherent nature. That doesn't exist. So Atisha is saying that you can meditate on the emptiness of these circumstances, how things arising, things, whether they're good arisings, whether they're bad arisings. One can free oneself from going up and down by meditating on the emptiness of either one, because their emptiness is exactly the same. Whether it's a good experience or a bad experience, the experience is empty of inherent existence. And in the emptiness of inherent existence, all things are equal. And if experiences, if you find them in an equal way, then your life doesn't go up and down. Because, Andarga said, you, our life should be like a wide river that doesn't change, like the Mississippi. It continues to flow, and not like a stream that dries up in the summertime. So having a great mind causes one to be continuous and stable. When objects of attraction or aversion appear, view them as you would illusions and apparitions, or like dreams. When we're dreaming, we can become very attached to objects. I remember as a kid, one time I got up and went to the closet to look for a shirt, and then I realized I had dreamt that shirt, and it wasn't in my closet at all. But I was so attached to having that shirt from the dream that I thought it was real. And then as soon as I realized that it wasn't real, I had some disappointment, but then I just, carried on because it just wasn't real. It was a dream. So like that, everything, it's the great masters tell us that, remember Lama Yeshe one time when he was teaching us his first group of Western disciples that got ordained. Then after in the time when we got ordained, it was also a Kalachakra initiation. And so after that, he and the other Western disciples that were there in Kopan, we got together for teachings on the tantric vows. And so one night when he was teaching, he said, what if I told you that everything that appears to you doesn't exist at all the way it appears? He says, like an illusion, like some fantasy. He says, would that scare you if I said that? Of course, he did say that. Of course, a lot of his students had done, LSD a lot. So that was a common experience. The early days, right? but uh, but that's the masters say that things do not exist the way they appear. Everything that arises appears to exist according to the identities we have become used to seeing them as having, right? They have what one a translator calls their customary reality, something we have become accustomed to due to familiarity, and also because of the customs of the use of speech and whatever society we live in, whatever local or expansive society, whatever it is. All these things seem to exist from their own side as the way we've become used to them. But that means that none of these things exist objectively from their own side because it's depending upon our thought. Our thought provides an identity, becomes familiar with an identity, so they don't exist independent of our own thought. I was listening to a physicist the other day, and somebody asked him about the reality of time and space. And he said, in another 40 years, nobody will be concerned about time and space. He says, because time and space, we all understand, is created by our thought. Therefore, they don't have any objective existence. And so, like all the effort that we've put into with, our physics, our mathematics, and the like with time and space, won't matter so much at that point. We'll have to get on to something else. And in Buddhism, space is just, there's two types of space. There's the type of space that you can see with your eyes, which is a gap between two objects. And then there's the permanent space, which is not permanent forever after. It's just permanent in that it doesn't change from moment to moment. And that is the mere negation of an obstruction to extension. So there's an absence of an obstruction for me to extend my arm in this direction. So that absence doesn't change from moment to moment, but I can put an obstruction there so there's no longer that space. But moment to moment, it doesn't change. It wasn't produced. The gap that we can see is produced by moving objects around, but that mere absence of obstruction. And that doesn't exist in its own right. It depends upon extension. It depends upon an obstruction to extension. It depends upon an absence to that obstruction. Therefore, it has no objective existence, and thus is depending upon thought. That's space. And time is just a measurement of change. That's all it is. So if something's not changing, there's no time. So we have time is divided into the present, the past, and the future. So the past is what has been and is no longer. The future is what may come, but it has not come yet. And the present is what's happening right now. But if you look for that objectively, between what has passed and what has not yet come, it's very hard to find that. Even with a razor, it's very hard to find that. It's like on a path, when a person might say, well, the present is what I'm covering at the moment as I'm walking. And so like Nagarjuna said, covering with what? I said, well, with my foot. And Nagarjuna said, but isn't it the fact that the tip of the toe has covered all of this ground that the back of the heel has not yet covered, but the toe has covered. And yet in front of the tip of the toe, nothing has yet been covered. So where is this present being covered? So therefore, even space, even time is dependent upon thought, and therefore it doesn't have objective existence. So, yeah, all of these things, the fact that this is a cup, from an ant's point of view, that's not a cup. It's just another thing that they have to climb to look for something good to eat, another obstacle, another challenge. That's all it is. And so on. The fact it's a cup is relative. It's relative to someone who needs a vessel to drink liquid out of. So depending upon thought, doesn't exist objectively as a cup. Like that. Or even that a cup means it's something that's singular. And yet, there's the inside, there's the outside, there's the handle, there's the lip, there's the base, let alone all the particles that make it up. It's a manyness. So it's only one thing relative to other cups. So it doesn't exist objectively as a cup. It depends upon thought. So, but nonetheless, things appear according to how we've become familiar with them. So it appears to be a cup, not recognizing that its identity of being a cup is something that we had to give it through our thinking. And we begin to assume that the cupness abides inherently in that object. And that's how it appears, due to our habituation with this thought of grasping at inherent existence. So if we start to see things as like objects in a dream, then our attachment to them and our aversion to them decrease. When you hear unpleasant words, view them as mere echoes. Well, that's not easy, but there's a good that's a good example. You know, my my father grew up on a farm, and we used to go to the farm to visit my grandparents, you know, and spend summers there and Christmas, Easter, and, you know, holidays. We'd leave the city and go to the farm. And there was a big barn there, and you could create an echo. It was big enough, you could shout, and then you'd hear whatever you shouted come back. Hello, and then you hear, hello. And we'd enjoy that because it sounded like there's another person over there saying hello. But you know there is no other person over there saying hello because that's just an echo of the sound that you created, right? So words, unpleasant words. Words in Buddhist philosophy, words are defined as indicative sounds. Indicative means sounds that indicate a meaning, indicate an object, like that, okay? But these sounds do not naturally indicate an object, as anyone who has tried to learn a language knows. You don't know what somebody's saying just because you hear the words coming out of their mouth. You have to learn the meaning that's associated with that sound, right? So the sound itself doesn't indicate a an object. It is just what is used to indicate objects, and we have to learn to associate the object with that sound. So in order to understand what somebody is saying, you have to have the knowledge in your own mind of what that sound means. So when you hear them saying something, then it seems like the meaning that they're indicating is coming from their side. But in fact, it's coming from your own mind because you have the knowledge to associate with that sound. Very similar to the echo, isn't it? So there's no point in getting upset with what somebody says because that would be like making yourself upset. You know, like an echo saying, "You're a jerk. You're a jerk." You don't really get upset with that echo, do you? Uh, and when injuries afflict your body, see them as the fruits of your past deeds. So all of our experiences, an experience is a mental factor. It's part of our mind, function of our mind, to experience objects as pleasurable, painful, or in a neutral way. And those experiences, because they are a mental object, have to have a mental cause. And the mental cause was karma, the intention, a mental cause, to engage in an action. And that creates the mental effect of an experience. So any experience that we have, another person who helped us get that experience is only a cooperative condition. It's like having the right soil for the seed to sprout. They're a cooperative condition, but they didn't create the seed. It's our own former action that created the seed. So something that unpleasant happens to us, resist blaming external cooperative conditions. If you feel like you need to blame something, blame the karmic seed that you acquired and the unskill of your previous former lifetime that created that, and have the determination that to try to avoid creating such negative karma and instead create positive karma. If you want to be happy, create the cause for it, which is happiness, which is virtuous actions. Next verse, dwell utterly in solitude beyond town limits. So here he's referring to those, the yogis who want to and have the time and the ability to meditate in solitude. They want to do that in order to be free from distraction. So for those persons who can't meditate like that, still it's important to be free from distraction when you meditate. So, the place where you meditate might be, a simple place where it just has an image of the Buddha, maybe simple objects like that, but not surrounded by distraction. You might have to put your cell phone under the pillow, turn it off during the time of your meditation, something like that. But try to be free from distraction so that with concentration, you can think about what you're studying. You can think more deeply about what you're meditating on. Like in doing a tantric meditation, which is deity meditation, you have to cultivate the identity of being the deity, right? So just like with ourself, being Tubten Pende depends upon me having a clear appearance of my body, right? And then I can think, oh, here I am sitting here. So in order to have to have a strong sense of identifying with the deity, you have to have a clear appearance of the deity. So to develop a clear appearance of the deity, you have to familiarize yourself with that appearance, and and have it in different places. Like for instance, I would think, if I visualize the deity in front of me, then how am I going to identify it being it? Then if I visualize myself as the deity, looking out through the eyes of the deity, which face is where? Becomes difficult, because we're used to having it, in front of us, and then the left becomes on the other side and the right is on the other, and all of this kind of stuff becomes difficult. And then, you can, okay, I can see my nose, but what about my feet? What am I standing on? Looking down, am I supposed to look down? Is it okay to look down? All these ideas, so you have to get used to it, right? In different position. And even when we think of ourselves, it's not always viewing ourselves through our subjective perspective. You can look at a photograph of yourself and say, that's me. So you can, have, see the deity that's in front of you, but then forget about you being separate and think that's me. You can do that. But all of these take time to develop some experience, some clarity with the deity, and then generate the thought, that's me. Without that, it's difficult to be saying that one is doing deity practice, let alone all the things that one's supposed to do before generating the deity, like, generating the bodhicitta motivation, meditating on emptiness, thinking that the mind meditating on emptiness appears as the deity. like that. And then staying with that appearance long enough to be able to say, here I am. I'm Vajrayogini, whatever the deity is. So that requires some freedom from distraction. So knowing that, it's important to try to cut things to create more time to practice. That's all. And one practices, and under all kinds of circumstances. Maybe not so good to try to do deity practice while one is driving the car, but there's all kinds of circumstances one can do, and to try to gain familiarity with all kinds of different positive states of mind. So these yogis who go out into the wilderness, they do that just because in solitude they're going to have less distraction. And I read recently of some Western, I don't know whether they were Buddhist academics or engaged in the physical sciences, like Dr. Herbert Benson, who's in the Harvard Medical School, and he went out to measure the temperature of yogis as they developed tumo meditation, things like that. But the comment was they would meet these yogis who just came out of the mountains because the Dalai Lama asked them to come out. And so here they were, people who live on their own for years. And they were so surprised how social they were. Normally a hermit has like cabin fever. They're afraid to even see people. And they kind of lose their ability to socialize and stuff like that. They're afraid of other human beings. And these yogis were not. And they may stay a certain time in solitude, but once they accomplish the purpose for being there, they leave that. Like Lama Tsongkhapa, he moved around a lot, studying with different masters. And then when people recognized who he was and his quality and where it was, they'd start to go to him to make offerings and stuff like that. And so then he'd leave because it became a distraction for his study and his meditation. But once he achieved his goal of the spiritual path, and he did that in this mountain Ganden, then he stayed there and continued to give teachings, and because then he didn't have to go anyplace anymore. And so he was able to stay in one place, and there were no distractions anymore. His mind was always where he wanted it to be. So, like the carcass of a wild animal, hide yourself away in the forest and live free of attachment. This is those lines is what inspired some of the Kadampas. What is it? It's like the heartfelt advice of the Kadampas, and the Kadampas was a tradition that Atisha started. His main disciple, Dromdomba, became the head of the Kadampa tradition like that. But the innermost jewels of the Kadampa include like being willing to leave society, to go out into solitude, to meditate where nobody knows what you're doing or where you are, and be willing to die in solitude like a wild animal dies. Being willing to do that. I mean, some people, when they think about going into solitude, they think, but what if I die there? Nobody will know. Oh, I can't do that. But these Kadampas who were following Atisha's instruction, they were willing to go out, and even if they died just like a wild animal, it's okay. And Milarepa, he said, if I pass away here in this cave by myself and nobody knows it, he said, perfect. That's perfect. I don't have anybody trying to inherit something from me. I don't have a lot of people crying around me as I'm trying to die in peace. So perfect to be able to die alone. He said, I love being in solitude. There's nobody further up the mountain like an aristocrat wondering what I'm doing down there. There's no servants lower in the mountain who are looking at me for, oh, what does he want now? What does he need now? He says, I'm by myself. Nothing to think about but my practice. Or, there was one time I was in this hotel room in Kathmandu. It's my first time in Kathmandu. I was in a hotel room. I was getting ready to go on an Everest trek, 2-week visa. I didn't return until 3 months later. And I'm in this hotel room, and somebody had written on the wall next to the bed as I kind of turned over and I looked. And it was a quotation by this one famous American poet and author from the 19th century. Thoreau was his last name. And he wrote, the most compatible companion is solitude. He's famous for writing, on Walden Pond, where he was in solitude there. And so no companion more companionable than solitude. So if you ever have an opportunity to do a weekend retreat someplace or longer, you might set the whole thing up and organize it, and food is going to be delivered, and it's going to be warm enough blankets, everything is going to be provided for you. And you walk into this cabin and the door shuts behind you and you're alone. Oh, I'm alone. Well, it's at those moments that it's good to remember these teachings of the great masters about how good it is to practice in solitude. Now you can direct your mind without any distractions and put your mind into those meanings that were taught by the Buddha himself and all the great masters that have followed. Always remain firm in your commitment. When a hint of procrastination and laziness arises, at that instant enumerate your flaws and recall the essence of spiritual conduct. There was this one Tibetan yogi who earlier in his life, he was a robber and he was infamous. And he attacked travelers on this one path, and everybody was afraid to go that way, but I guess it was the only way that they could go to do their business. And when he would attack on a horse with a sword and everything. And one time when he was attacking, he had cut open the underside of a horse, and it was a mare. And she was with a baby, foaled inside her that had come out. And before she died, she was licking this her baby, and it totally melted the heart of this bad guy. Ben Kungal was his name. Totally melted his heart. And at that moment, he decided never again was he going to engage in this kind of activity. So he gave it up, became a monk, and meditated. And he wrote about his meditations and the way that he would train his mind. And one time he wrote that when he'd be sitting in his cave and he was supposed to be meditating on a certain subject, but then he would start to just daydream, and then he'd catch himself that, what am I doing? He says, I'm not here to daydream. I'm not here to think about this, that, and the other thing. I'm here to meditate. I'm here to train my mind. He says, and then he would refer to himself in the third person or the second person. He says, "You," he said, "if you continue to do like this, I'm going to tell all the benefactors what kind of a lazy son of a gun you are. And they're going to be so upset with you, they're not going to give one more grain of rice to you, not one more handful of tsampa to eat. And that'll be right for you, because otherwise you're wasting their resource that they're providing. They think they're going to get merit by supporting a meditator. But if you're here just daydreaming, you're no meditator. So I'm going to tell them." So he immediately would meditate and act properly. And he was following, Atisha's advice, just like that. So instantly enumerate your flaws, and you'll become instantly aware of the need to train your mind. And then put your whole being into spiritual conduct. However, if you do encounter others, speak peacefully and truthfully. Do not grimace or frown, but always maintain a smile. So I've had, masters who've talked about that, who always presenting a pleasant appearance to others, so that it's a practice of generosity. And the Bodhisattvas, they've taken vows to practice generosity in the other perfections. So it's a very simple way to practice generosity, of giving a pleasant appearance to others. There was one great master, I think could have been Longri Tangpa, who's the author of the 8 Verses of Training the Mind. It was either him or Tomi Zangpo, who wrote the 37 Practices of All Bodhisattvas. And his students said, he said, "You should smile more." He said, the people are talking about, you always look so sad and stuff. They're talking about that. And the master said, "I think a lot about the suffering in life and what all living beings have to go through because of being under the control of afflictions and karma. It's difficult for me to smile." So, so it's not mandatory, but it is a practice of generosity. And also the Bodhisattva, and as I said, the main audience for this is bodhisattvas, or those who aspire to be bodhisattvas, to have the opportunity to have a positive impression on others, a positive influence on others. They have to be willing to approach you, right? So if you have a pleasant appearance, then they would be willing to approach. But this is not always the case. Geshe Andari told us a story of one bodhisattva who had a positive influence with everybody in a village, except one older woman who lived on her own. He had no connection with her whatsoever, and he regretted that, because if he had some connection with her, then he could have some benefit with her, whether in the present lifetime or future lifetimes. There would be some benefit, opportunity to benefit her. So the only way that he could create a relationship with her was he got up on his horse and ran his horse over her flower bed. And she came out of the house yelling and cursing at him. And he went, "Yeah, I succeeded. I have a relationship with her now." So the bodhisattvas will do whatever it takes to benefit living beings. In general, when you see others, be free of miserliness and delight in giving. Relinquish all thoughts of envy. So, especially for practitioners, they try to steal as much time as they can for their practice. So that means time that they could have been devoting to gathering wealth. So they may not have a lot to give. But Atisha is saying, still practice generosity. Don't be miserly, and if somebody comes and, offer them some tea, offer them a glass of water, be generous. Don't be miserly, and delight in the opportunity to give to other living beings, and relinquish the thought of envy. So somebody who's a practitioner, that would be, oftentimes they're more poor than somebody else, but they're engaged in the Bodhisattva practice. So they're trying to transform themselves into somebody that can be of help, to be of use to others, like giving them teachings. So they have a great wealth that another person could greatly benefit from. But if what's going through their mind, they're thinking, oh, I wish I had, oh, look what they have. Oh, I wish I had that. Then it becomes uncomfortable for this other person, right? To Because they maybe will, why is they talking about my car? They want to steal my car? What kind of a master is this? What am I supposed to learn from this person? Like that. So he's saying, get rid of thoughts of envy, of jealousy. Just rejoice in whatever benefits they have, rejoice in that, but then try to give something more to them. They can benefit. They may have all the resources they need for their current lifetime, but what about their future lifetimes? What about the achievement of Buddhahood? Things like this. That's what one can give. Then, to help soothe others' minds, forsake all disputes and be endowed with forbearance. So the bodhisattva, in order to have bodhicitta, you can't exclude even one living being. You have to be working for the welfare of all living beings. So Atisha is saying, don't get involved in disputes that are never going to resolve anything, because people will cling to their view on certain things and you're not going to dissuade them. So why create discord? Avoid those kind of disputes that are futile disputes. Avoid doing that. And this is a good time in this country anyway, right? There's so much divisiveness that, if you have an opportunity to be of benefit to somebody, you don't want to get involved in some dispute which will only create a distance and won't benefit them at all. So he's saying avoid those kind of futile disputes, and rather practice patience, endure their point of view, which may differ from your own, and see if there's an opportunity to be a positive influence on them. Be free of flattery and fickleness in friendship. Be steadfast and reliable at all times. So whatever friendships one forms, be a reliable friend, not somebody who changes face overnight. Somebody who smiles with you in one moment and the next moment is saying bad things about you to other people. Be a reliable friend. And do not disparage others. So sometimes there's a tendency when somebody asks how somebody is doing, and you might talk about some fault that you've seen them have as the first thing. Try to avoid doing that, Atisha is saying. He says, rather, don't disparage others. Be kind, be generous, like be a good friend. Always abide with a respectful demeanor. So respect the people that you're with, respect other people that you're friends with, but they're not there at the moment. Try to be respectful for everyone. When giving advice, maintain compassion and altruism. Never defame, okay, when giving advice, compassion and altruism. So when one is practicing generosity, you're trying to provide something with a resource you think they can use, something that will benefit them. So the teachings are the same way, something that will benefit them. So one is acting out of this desire to benefit, which arises from compassion, which arises, altruism is the state of mind that is more concerned about others than oneself. So put yourself and your own needs out of the way, and try to give the teachings or advice just to benefit that living being, not something in the back of one's mind thinking that one may get something from them in the future. No, just purely out of a positive motivation to help. Never defame the teachings. So, there's all kinds of. Oh, here's one thing: when the Buddha was asked by his disciples of when, so he was talking about, have I said everything that needs to be said? And I think Ananda said, oh yes. So then that was the reason why Shakyamuni decided to pass away when he did. So that's why ever since then, all the disciples request their teachers to live forever. But the Buddha had said that, he said, anything that's well said, regard it as I have said it. So any kind of beneficial advice that's given to living beings. So then all these different religious traditions, all of them have something good to offer to help people avoid becoming negative, to cultivate positive qualities within themselves. All of them have something good to offer. And there can't be just one religion because people are too different, right? They're just so different. They need different methods, different paths. So long as they're, positive paths, they need those. So what we're being advised here is don't disparage all these other paths that happen to be different from your path. Don't disparage them. There's something that are beneficial for other living beings. Let them get the benefit of that. Don't discourage them, and don't talk about their faults like that. If somebody who's not born into a Buddhist tradition, who then is attracted to the Buddhist tradition, they're attracted by the people that are practicing. So they're not attracted necessarily by the philosophy. They learn the philosophy later. They're often attracted by the people that are practicing. So if somebody is, being a good person, rejoicing in the virtue of others, rejoicing in the beneficial advice that's given by other founders, thinking, oh, that's wonderful that they said such a thing, then that's what we should be doing rather than criticizing. Never defame the teachings. Whatever practices you admire with aspiration in the 10 spiritual deeds, strive diligently. It says here dividing day and night, but I think the real word is during day and night. So you're practicing continuously. The 10 spiritual deeds are the 6 perfections, generosity, morality, patience, effort, concentration, wisdom, and 4 more to get the 10 perfections. So there's influence, prayer, skillful means, and and primordial wisdom. Those are the remaining four. So these Atisha's recommending engaging in those practices. I think Maitreya has another list of 10. I don't know if I remember them all, but they're things like copying down the sutras, writing them down, um, practicing generosity, um, listening to the teachings, um, reciting sutras, reading the teachings to oneself and also reading them aloud to others, contemplating the meaning of the teachings that one has heard, gaining familiarity with that meaning through meditation, cultivating single-pointed concentration. That's most of the 10. But for the bodhisattvas, it's the 10 perfections, and for everybody else, it's these other 10 deeds to be done each day. And, like somebody like Lama Zopa, he enjoyed writing out the sutras, like in gold letters and stuff like that. He has done so many of those things that there's always something to do. If one is getting tired of just reading the scriptures, there are other things one can do too, besides meditating. One can copy teachings. One can read the teachings to others. There was one. It was often practiced. There was this one master. He was a great scholar in the Nyingma tradition, who used to sit below my window, and he would do his prayers in the morning out loud, so that even the insects would benefit from him doing his prayers. Whatever virtues you gather through the 3 times, past, present, and future, dedicate them towards the unexcelled great awakening. So, and this is whatever, even the small virtuous action, dedicate it. If you dedicate it, it's like putting it in the bank. You won't lose it through a moment of anger like that, or it won't ripen through some temporary positive experience that then exhausts that seed. If it's dedicated with the bodhicitta motivation, it will last until enlightenment. Disperse your merit to all sentient beings and utter the peerless aspiration prayers of the 7 limbs at all times. 7 limbs are, prostrations, making offerings, confession of bad deeds, rejoicing in the virtues of others, requesting the teachings, requesting the teachers to continue without any interruption, such as to not pass away, and dedicating the merits of the previous 6 to achieve the supreme enlightenment for the welfare of all living beings. There's a number of these prayers in 7 limbs. It's called the 7-limb prayer. There's a number of different translations. Some are very extensive, like the Guru Puja, the Lama Chupa practice. That has the 7 limbs in it very extensively. There's prayers that are just 7 lines, like that, something that is meaningful for you. I translated my own just because it was meaningful. So try to do those practices when you have an opportunity, before you study, before you meditate, something like that. When I worked for the university, And in the beginning of the day, I would get a cup of water and put it on this book stand. At the top of the book stand, I had my altar and put it there. And then I'd do a prayer of the seven limbs to start my day off and include in my dedication that what I did that day would be beneficial for living beings and also would accumulate some merit. And as soon as you start thinking benefiting all living beings, then the merit is multiplied by the number of beneficiaries. So all living beings are countless. So that means that small act, positive action you did accumulates limitless merit. The Buddha one time asked his disciples, if you offered planets filled with jewels to the three jewels of refuge, do you think you would accumulate a lot of merit? And the disciples responded, "Oh, yes, Master. That would be a lot of merit." And the Buddha then said, a bodhisattva with the bodhicitta motivation that offers one mouthful of food to a dog would accumulate vastly more merit. So use that as an example for any virtuous action you do with the bodhicitta motivation. That is a lot of merit to dedicate. And that's one reason why the bodhisattva path doesn't take forever. They accumulate a lot of merit. So that is a fuel to get you there quickly. If you proceed thus, you'll swiftly perfect merit and wisdom. Perfecting merit results in the form body of the Buddha. Wisdom results in the mind body of the Buddha, and eliminates the two defilements, the defilement that stops one from achieving liberation and the defilements that stop one from knowing all objects. Since your human existence will be meaningful, you'll attain the unexcelled enlightenment. The wealth of faith, the wealth of morality, the wealth of giving, the wealth of learning, the wealth of personal integrity, the wealth of shame and embarrassment, and the wealth of insight. These are the seven riches or jewels of the Aryas. So that's what he's saying. That's the kind of wealth that you should be striving for. These precious and excellent jewels are the seven inexhaustible riches. Do not speak of these to those non-humans, those who are not interested in the Dharma and the Dharma practice. You keep your practice to yourself, unless there's somebody that you can benefit from, or not benefit from, but provide benefit towards. Among others, guard your speech. When alone, guard your mind. I've heard those two lines quoted so many times. When you're with others, guard your speech. When you're by yourself, guard your mind. Those were the last two points of advice that Atisha provided in these 111 lines of advice called the precious Garland of Bodhisattvas. So if you have a question, something that I said might have been confusing, or fortunately, the advice that Tisha is giving here, Kishinau and Dargay pointed it out. He said, a lot of this anybody could benefit from, not just bodhisattvas. So it is, yeah, it's pretty clear. And, but it's nice to have that kind of clarity because it's, we can't always be just sitting in meditation and we're up and engaging in all kinds of activities. And so it's good to have in the back of our minds some advice that we may remember to keep our mind on the path and avoid distractions. So this, huh? Oh, there's a question.
I had one question for you, Pende. First off, thank you so much for spending your weekends teaching and sharing these with us. It's been wonderful. Appreciate it. Just looking at the end line here in this book, it reads, this concludes the Bodhisattva Jewel Garland composed by the Indian abbot, not Atisha. Somebody else has written there, Deepam Karasijanyana. I'm curious if that's a different name for Atisha or what the relationship is between those two individuals.
Right. So Dipankara Sri Jnana was his ordination name. And it's quite common
See.
that that many of the masters don't go by their ordination names or their common names, but rather they go by a name of a place they're from. Like take Tsongkhapa, for instance. That wasn't his ordination name. That Tsongkhapa was the person from Tsongkha, or onion country. He was the person from onion country. So like that, Lord Atisha is most famously known as Atisha, but this Dipankara Sri Jnana was his ordination name.
And one question here too.
The what?
I have one question toward the end. Similarly, can you clarify what the wealth of conscience and the wealth of shame mean?
Okay, so conscience refers to personal integrity, and that means avoiding a non-virtuous action, using oneself as the reason. Okay, I'm not the kind of person who does that, so I'm not going to do it. That's what conscience means here. And the shame is avoiding a non-virtuous action, using others as the reason. And so, like, thinking, I'm not going to do that. What if others found out if I did such a thing? I would be so embarrassed by that. So using others. Would my parents like it if I did this? No. So, like that. So, so like Jeffrey Hopkins, when he translated these two terms, he translated it as shame and embarrassment. Shame using oneself, embarrassment others. Others will use like personal integrity and shame and like that. But that's what the two, and Nagarjuna, I remember him in one of his texts saying that shame and embarrassment, these two are the main friends of the ordinary practitioner. Because, before one develops wisdom, realizing emptiness or great compassion and these other higher states of mind that will keep one away from non-virtuous action, it'll be shame and embarrassment that'll keep you away. So they're the friends of the best friends of the ordinary person. Yeah, and it's, some people, they try, they've done some actions that give them a heavy conscience. And so they try to get rid of their heavy conscience by trying to become numb. That's the wrong thing to do. It's the wrong thing to do. That regretting non-virtuous action is a good thing. But you don't have to stay in that state of mind. the next step is to make a determination to avoid that kind of action in the future. Take refuge in the three jewels, who can provide, like a doctor can provide you with an antidote to the negative karma when it accumulates, and then engage in that virtuous action. Generally speaking, any virtuous action done in order to purify negative karma will purify the negative karma. And then there's some actions that are considered particularly powerful, like reciting the mantra of Bodhisattva, doing prostrations, things like that. But, you know, like as an antidote to negative karma of taking life would be saving lives. So things like that. So any virtuous action done for the sake of purifying will purify. It's just some are more powerful than others. Reciting sutras like the Golden Light Sutra, things like that, very powerful for purifying. Okay. Well, thank you all very, very much. And
Thank
it
you
was
so much.
really appreciate the opportunity to be able to share some of the things that my teachers have taught me and I've tried to put into practice. I'm not a very good practitioner, but my teachers were great. And so maybe some of that can come through in my words. And I hope that was beneficial for you. And if you did find anything that was said here that's beneficial, then please don't forget it. You can dedicate your merits to not forget what was beneficial and to put it into practice as much as possible to achieve the state of supreme enlightenment for the welfare of all the countless living beings, not excluding even one. Thank you.